Copyright 2026, Sarah Irvin, all rights reserved. This original work may not be copied, reproduced, distributed, adapted, or used without the author's explicit permission, not for AI training or inclusion in datasets. My dear Lettie, wouldn't you like to go back to the days when you used to come down home and spin, only for one night, and sleep with me and have a good giggle? But we can't, and we are surely growing old. I wish you might happily return of this day. Sincerely your friend, Nellie. March 25th, 1915. The snow on the ground was slowly relinquishing its hold on the earth. She gazed out the window into the achromatic world and heaved a sigh. Even with the promise of warmer days full of color hanging in the air, there was little hope in her soul. Memories have a way of creeping into conscious thought and planting seeds of emotion long since stored away. The cold and dark days of winter are the perfect medium to allow them to flourish and grow into tangled vines that creep their way into hearts and minds, destroying long-built foundations and walls of protection. Time can be the best defense against the troublesome thoughts that plague the mind, but there are some so powerful that once evoked can sour the heart and erase the work of forgetting. She looked at the back of her hands and wondered when she truly became an old woman. It had seemed only moments ago that she was a child swimming in the pond behind her family's home. Had it been so long since the night she saw the stranger who would become the man who preceded her in death? The memory of her first and only child not living past his initial breath was just below the surface, threatening to make her fully aware of the pain once again. Every joint was a smoldering fire. The wet and cold of the days did not help her feel young any longer. St. Patrick's Day had just passed. A silly holiday, spent by most with ale and friends, was perhaps the biggest catalyst in her newfound sorrow. Of all the remembrances that made her feel every year of her age, that day and those memories threatened to spiral her into the depression she had been fighting to stave off for quite a while. More than half a century before, the Maine winters had driven her in search of warmer weather and would change her life in more ways than she imagined. February had never been her favorite month. It was always the coldest of the winter months and included the insufferable Valentine's Day. After becoming aware that she was not as important to the man she was fond of as he was to her, the decision to make the trip to Georgia seemed to be a necessity. Navigating through the harsh winters of the Northeast was not an easy task in those days, but weeks later she arrived in the beautiful and enchanting city of Savannah. The aroma of flowers was the first sensation she experienced, save the sights. Dogwood, azalea, and flowers she had never seen were blooming, releasing their perfume scents into the air, attracting both herself and the constantly working honeybees. The warmth and humidity in the air, the green grass and colors of spring, people in fine attire out for strolls without the need of heavy layers of clothes. She breathed a sigh of contentment and went in search of life. Bakeries, restaurants, and alehouses reminded her that her travels did not include much in the way of food and drink. She stopped at a boarding house near the center of town to inquire about a place to stay and a hot meal. The lady of the house was a widow who had taken in boarders after the death of her husband. The woman had also recently purchased some servants at the auction a few weeks prior, more as a way of saving them than as a way to demonstrate her dominance over another human. The house was a majestic castle in comparison to the homestead in Noblesboro where she had grown up. The events of the day, coupled with the journey she had undertaken, were beginning to make themselves known to her. With a southern supper like none she had experienced during her upbringing in her belly, she retired to bed, anticipation and wonder flooding her thoughts as she drifted to sleep. Rays of the rising sun drifted through the lace curtains, creating ethereal light play on the bed. She woke to the sounds of birds singing and the smell of eggs, bacon, and other breakfast foods. The house had come alive for the day. The experience of so many strangers under the same roof was new and slightly off-putting to the young woman. Not used to the bustle of a working home, she retreated to the sewing room shortly after breakfast. As she crossed the threshold of the room, her eyes settled on the woman at the spinning wheel. She appeared to be the same age as herself. The woman's clothing was clean and appeared untattered. Her skin was smooth and glowed in the radiant morning sun. Although this was not the first time she had encountered a servant woman in another's home, this was the first time she saw one who seemed to be at home in the house rather than at odds with the social restraints of the time. The woman, although seeming to be conscious of the intruder in the room, did not acknowledge her. With delicate yet capable hands, she fed the raw cotton into the machine, gently twisting and pulling it. It was as beautiful and captivating as any ballet. Watching for only a few more minutes, she retreated out of the room and left the woman to dance with the machine in the sunny glow of the day. The city was a maze of crowded avenues and shops full of exotic wares fresh off the boats in port. Spices she had never heard of, clothing that appeared to be weaved from pure golden strings, men grunting and heaving in the midst of hard labor in the rising humidity so early in the year. These sights were so alien to her, yet comforting in their commonplace to the native Georgians. She ventured to the end of the dock and gazed at the ocean. The sun glimmering off the water like diamonds and the warm breeze from the ocean cleansed her mind of any worries or frantic energy lying in wait. Amazing how this was the same ocean she had seen so many times in her youth. After stopping at a bakery and buying a few pieces of clothing better suited for the new climate, she set back towards the boarding house. Walking, she encountered so many people with joyous and sincere smiles, mothers pushing children in baby carriages, and strong young men working on homes in various buildings on her route. A glance across the street revealed an image she recognized. The woman from the sewing room in the boarding house was making her way back towards the center of town. She carried a small basket and had her hair tied securely under a bonnet the color of baled hay. Unsure of how to introduce herself, she chanced a shy wave towards the woman on the other side of the street. The woman smiled and beckoned her to cross and join her. As she approached the woman, she became aware of her air of self-possession. The woman did not appear to be conscious of her solitary nature, nor did she appear to dwell on her status in the changing world. Her mahogany skin seemed to be at odds with the way she presented herself. A small town in Maine afforded few opportunities to see society's true nature towards those deemed different or of lower status, but the woman seemed truly free and unrestricted. Courteous exchanges revealed the woman's name to be Nellie. As they strolled towards town, she described her situation in more detail. Nellie had been a slave to a man in town until a few weeks prior. She, along with many others, had been sold in the face of a progressive movement to free them. The woman at the boarding house had purchased her and a few others with the hopes of giving them a better life and a chance at freedom when the times allowed it. Nellie had been fortunate to be a servant in the home of her former owner, rather than endure physical labor on the grounds. Her attention to detail and ability to sew and knit made her more appealing as a housemaiden. Their stroll ended when they arrived at Nellie's destination. With plans made to meet later at the house, they parted ways. Turning back towards Nellie, she approached her and smiled, embarrassed. "Lettie, my name is Lettie." Supper was another feast of new flavors and aromas. It seemed as though every day was spent in preparation of a meal royalty would find extravagant. A new traveler had arrived at the house just before Lettie had returned. He was a small and rather round man with dirty-looking hair and an abrupt manner of speaking. He bragged of his travels throughout the eastern coast and up into Canada. His stories had the quality of well-worn fables, repeated until they lost their crisp edges and began to fray and molder. But the house was cheerful and brimming with laughter and good cheer, and felt oddly like a homecoming rather than a new adventure. Nellie did not arrive until the sun had just enough hold on the horizon to make its descent seem a struggle rather than a daily occurrence involving it and the darkness. She greeted Lettie as she ascended the stairs, her packages and bags from the day's acquisitions making her slightly unsteady. Helping her to unlock her door, Lettie then aided her in placing her goods in the room. For the first few minutes, the women laughed, and examined and compared their respective shopping expeditions and acquired commodities. Whilst Lettie told a story about her first taste of a local food, Nellie stopped smiling and appeared to blanch. Her normally dark complexion turned ashen, and her eyes widened in an expression that related fear. Lettie turned to the door and became aware of the new traveler staring in the room. His round face was sweaty, and his expression was a mixture of disgust and malevolent thoughts. He stood rigid and with complete disregard for his blatant glowering. The air in the room chilled and grew thick with tension. The man's face seemed to twist and change into one of a mischievous demon. His smile became a dark and horrid slash, his eyes narrowing. He uttered the smallest of chuckles, but this one was void of any good cheer. He nodded towards Nellie, his ominous expression running chills through her blood. She let out a small gasp as he continued down the hallway and out of view. Dashing up from the bed with inhuman speed, she ran towards the door and slammed it shut, shaking the windows in their frames. Turning back towards the interior of the room, Lettie saw her face transformed into a grimace of terror and sadness. She fell onto her knees and began to sob, her whole body shaking as her breath heaved. Lettie rushed to her side, holding Nellie while she completed her fall to the floor, her face pressed to the wood, her tears finding their way between the joints. She stayed in this position and sobbed until she fell asleep, cradled in Lettie's arms. Sometime during the night she awoke. Lettie, too, was woken up by the movement of her fallen friend. They sat on the floor as Nellie related the story that was tragic enough to transform this strong woman into a weeping child. While she worked in her former master's home, she had met the traveler. He had been an acquaintance and had stayed there a few times. One night he found his way into her bedroom. For hours he had beaten and raped her again and again. Only as the sun began to rise did he leave her room. He gathered his belongings and continued on his way as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Her then master had even threatened to beat her further if she made a scene about what had transpired. Never had she thought she would see him again. Lettie listened to the story, hiding her horror and anger inside, only showing her compassion and sadness for her new friend. Helping Nellie to her feet, the women climbed into bed, exhausted physically from the emotionally draining events. They fell asleep again, holding each other. The door creaked open almost soundlessly. Any other night, those quiet footfalls would have been ignored or unheard. The squeaking of the wood would have been blamed on an aging home. The traveler crept towards the bed, unaware that there were two women occupying it in the blackness. He leaned over the sleeping figure and placed a hand firmly over the first mouth he could identify. Had he been less preoccupied with malevolent thoughts and more aware of the state of the room, he would have noticed the other figure in the bed. He would also have been aware of the hand gliding through the air towards his head, a heavy metal candlestick held firmly in its grip. The blow was so swift and forceful, he had no time to make a sound as he crumpled onto the bed and rolled to the floor. There are few times when ears work so well as when the possibility of being caught is a threat. The two women waited in pregnant silence. The traveler's body lay face up on the floor, eyes wide with surprise, blood seeping from his left ear. The last futile gurgles of breath escaped his mouth. Minutes passed without the telltale signs of a party seeking the source of the strange sound. They sat on the bed, shivering from both adrenaline and the fear they felt. The longer the body lay in the room, the harder it would be to explain the situation as being a necessary outcome of the preceding events. Something would have to be done. Without argument, they decided to hide the body. They would place him somewhere no one would look for him, take his belongings to make it appear as though he had left. Lettie threw the thin blanket from the bed over the body and started towards the door. They needed a plan, and they needed it soon. She opened the door and peered into the hallway. Silence and darkness greeted her senses. Closing the door behind her, she followed the hallway to the staircase and silently crept down the flight of stairs to the main floor. The back door was through the kitchen. The large fenced-in yard lay at the back of the lot, covered with trees and a large garden. A shed lay in the furthest corner. Along the back fence, behind the garden plot, were a few dogwood trees, blooming and fragrant even in the early spring air. She returned to the room and laid out the plan. They would carry the body down the steps, through the back door, and out to the shaded ground under the trees. With tools from the shed, they would dig a large enough hole, bury the body, and clean up before the first light peeked above the horizon. Wrapping the body in the thin blanket now covering it, they opened the door, picked up their heavy secret, and slipped out into the hall. Heaving and sweating, straining to move yet keep quiet, the two women followed the carefully laid plan, knowing each step they took was away from the possibility of accident and towards the act of murder. They made it to the kitchen and near the door before light shocked them into reality. The lady of the house stood at the threshold of the kitchen, her arms crossed over her chest with a curious look on her visage. Nellie, already shaken to the point of near hysteria, dropped the body and gasped. She threw her hands to her face. This was not the composed and confident woman that was in the sewing room only a day before. This woman was exuding fear from every pore like a feral, trapped animal. Lettie only dropped her head in shame and sadness and prepared for the consequences. Curious the friends that are found in the most trying of times. The lady of the house smiled and closed the gap towards the women. She bent to Nellie and held her head as she shook, shushing her strained sobs and stroking the back of her head. She looked up to Lettie and nodded. With that gesture, a third party was now a part of their tragic circumstances. Helping Nellie to her feet, she guided her out the back door, setting her in a chair on the patio. She returned to the kitchen, extinguished the candle, and resumed the spot once occupied by Nellie. The new crew worked their way towards the back of the grounds, dropping the cargo onto the earth at the fence. She walked to the shed and returned with shovels and gloves. Stripping off her sleeping garments, she encouraged Lettie to do the same. The fewer pieces of evidence to alert others to their nighttime gardening, the better. The sounds of crickets and screech owls communicating was punctuated with the intrusion of shovels turning the soil. They worked until even the gloves could not prevent blisters on their tired and swollen hands. A rooster's crow accompanied the last pat of the shovel on the newly tilled earth beneath the pink dogwood. As they walked back to the house to clean up, robins populated the soil, looking for bugs and worms brought up from their moonlit activities. Nellie had returned to the house hours before to scour the room of traces of the traveling man. Breakfast was on the table without delay. No one save the three conspirators had an inkling of what had transpired. No one noticed the empty chair that had been filled at last night's dinner. The day was too beautiful to follow the night that had just passed. The sun shone down on the city, warming the air. The breeze populated the city with fragrant smells of flowers blooming in gardens and parks. Birds sang, people laughed, children played. The three women had gathered in the sewing room after breakfast to discuss what had happened. The tone of the room was somber and tense, their voices scarcely above a whisper, the threat of discovery present in every footfall. The lady of the house spoke to the two women as a mother speaks to distraught children. She assured them that no one had known what had happened. No one was wise to their nocturnal activities. The police would not show up at the door. There was no curious relatives to inquire about their missing kin. He was a terrible man and a poor excuse for a human. She did not like him and never would. The lady then instructed the other two women to try to exhibit a semblance of normalcy. The more they attempted to hide what they did, the more curious people would become in regards to their behavior. Eat, laugh, shop. Living their life was the only way to disguise a death. The three women were silent for a few moments after their discussion. The lady of the house retreated to the back to finish laundry and ready lunch. Lettie and Nellie sat in silence for a bit longer. Shortly, Nellie stood and made her way to the wheel. Far from the woman she had been only more than a day before, her hair was frizzy and dull, her skin had taken on a yellow hue. She sat at the wheel and assumed the posture of a woman defeated. Then, with a deep breath, she sat up a bit straighter, smoothed her hair, and pulled it back. She reached for a mass of raw cotton. The twisting and spinning motions of the activity quickly resumed their dance-like appeal. Nellie appeared to grow stronger the longer she was seated behind the machine. Lettie noticed her demeanor change, a calmness returning once again. The self-possessed woman was returning. The two women sat in their spots for hours, not speaking, but the silence was anything but awkward. It was healing. The morning soon evolved into afternoon, and then evening took its hold once again. Both women retreated to their rooms as night fell, only a glance in parting. Exhaustion forced them into a deep and mercifully dreamless sleep. Lettie awoke to the sounds of a busy house once again. She sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed, orienting herself to the state of wakefulness. Padding softly towards the door, she opened it up and peered into the hallway. Nellie's door was still closed, but people were climbing up and down the stairs, hands full with tables and chairs. Their appearance suggested workmen in the midst of a project. She closed her door and retreated back to the comfort of her bed. Staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over in her head, she became aware of how much she needed Nellie at that moment. She needed another body laying next to her, the warming comfort of a human form, the tender embrace of a companion. At the same moment, her door opened. Nellie stood at the threshold, still dressed in her nightgown. She smiled softly and closed the door behind her. Soft footsteps brought her closer to the bed. She lifted the sheets and slid into the warmth and comfort of the fabric, the body already there radiating more heat. The two women held each other, their embrace like that of two children, innocent and needy. They remained there until hunger announced itself with urgent pleads. They dressed and proceeded to the dining area. The hustle and bustle of the early morning was due to preparations for St. Patrick's Day. The holiday was celebrated by the city with a large parade and festivities. Some buildings along the route hosted gatherings which included food and drink. Although a few days away, the extravagant celebration by the lady of the house necessitated early measures. There was food to be prepared, drinks and ales to be brought in, and decorations to be made and displayed. The next few days passed without event. Lettie and Nellie spent many hours in the sewing room, teacher and student creating tapestries for the party to come. They laughed more and more as the hours passed. Excitement for the coming celebration electrified the air, helping to remove the somber instance a few days prior. Their developing friendship was blossoming into a lasting relationship. Even the women were aware of this progression. Only when either of them looked to the backyard did a serious tone overtake their demeanor. The parade was an event unlike Lettie had ever seen. People danced and performed in decadent green attire, fabrics and patterns exotic to a small Maine town. The street performers moved in ways that Lettie had not thought possible. Children dressed in silly costumes and carried pots filled with coins. Banners proudly announced Irish heritage and Catholic upbringing. Almost as soon as the parade ended, people flooded the streets in a celebratory mood. Drinks were passed around and food was available at numerous houses. The lady of the boarding house herded guests into the backyard. Tables of food and drink populated every foot of grass. Chairs were placed in any unused patch. The mood was light and playful. People were jaunty and animated. No one had even the slightest inkling that less than a few feet away, and as many feet below, there was the decomposing body of a murdered man. Neither Lettie nor Nellie were of Irish descent, but it appeared not to matter to the majority of partygoers, as they too were not Irish, so the women threw themselves into the revelry of the day. Both women had went shopping for dresses worthy of such a party the day before. They had helped each other with hair and cosmetics. Nellie had borrowed a necklace from Lettie's collection. The two women joined the lady of the house for a short while, then split off to meet some of the other guests. The party wound down in the early hours of the next day. More than a few people stumbled off the property still holding a drink in hand. One man fell asleep in the hallway and was carried to bed by one of the male servants. This year's party did not bring any broken furniture or bones. The cleanup was left to be completed after at least a few hours' sleep. For the first time in days, the house was quiet until long after breakfast. The two women fell asleep, tangled in the bedsheets in Lettie's room, each body a pillar of comfort for the other woman. March said goodbye, and April was welcomed, bringing warmer air and longer days. Lettie and Nellie were almost inseparable. Nellie continued to work at the boarding house, and Lettie had taken a job mending clothes for an elderly neighbor. This was truly the only time in which they were not together. As often happens, and perhaps part of the human condition, people talk. They gossip about marriages and divorces, about children and affairs. The two women soon became the focus of such activities. Whether it was the difference in their skin color, the disparity of their social status, or simply because they were two single women, people began to question their relationship. They appeared to spend too much time together for everyone's comfort. Before the comments could worm their way into the ears and minds of the majority, a letter came in the mail. It was addressed to Lettie. The news was unexpected and devastating. Lettie's father had been falling a tree on their property. The tree had not been as healthy as it appeared. With only a few swings of the axe, the tree collapsed in on its trunk. With no time to move, her father was crushed under the weight of a tree 5 times his age. He was not found for almost a week, the tree covering everything but his feet. The news was as painful as any physical blow. Lettie fainted. Goodbyes are as personal as the people that deliver them. They can be happy and joyous, with promises of meetings and letters. They can be somber and devastating with their finality. Lettie's and Nellie's was somewhere in between. Although there was the assurance of meeting again, both women knew it was not the case. They would write back and forth, relaying important moments and sending messages of cheer and well wishes, but they would never be in the other's physical presence again. Lettie was scheduled to leave on the train shortly before sunrise. The lady of the house and Nellie saw her off on the platform. The two friends cried as they said their goodbyes. The tears were not only for their friendship, but for all that they had been through in the short time they had known each other. Pulling away, Nellie pulled a small pink flower from her pocket and tucked it into the barrette in Lettie's hair. It was a flower from the dogwood in the backyard. The lady of the house sent her along with an assortment of food items hidden away in a small wicker basket. A favorite new food, cornbread and fresh honey, snuggled in the bottom. Lettie started to board the train, but felt a hand on the small of her back. It was Nellie. Stepping off backwards, she turned to face her companion. The two figures stood still on the platform, facing each other, like stone sentinels meant to keep watch. Nellie leaned close to Lettie, her face angling slightly to the right. She softly planted a brief kiss on her friend's lips, only lingering long enough for Lettie to smell the scent of her perfume once again. Tears started to form in Nellie's eyes, but before they could find their way to the rows of her mahogany cheeks, she turned and sprinted off the platform, turning the corner, her sobs seen, not heard. Lettie then returned to her place on the steps of the train, climbed the metal planks, and found her seat. Gazing out the window, her forehead pressed to the glass, she began to cry as well. Broken breaths punctuated their normal breathing. Tears joined the condensation already on the glass. As the train jolted to a start, she thought back to the moments of the past couple of months, and with every turn of the train's wheels, images of memories took the place of the scenes that slowly disappeared out of sight. The postcard dropped from her hands onto the cold wooden floor. One slow rolling tear streamed down her lined and aged face, joining the paper on the wood. Her hand found the newly formed trail and wiped it dry. A sigh escaped her mouth as she dropped her head to search for the fallen correspondence. Knees cracked and muscles protested as she bent to retrieve the postcard. With the paper in hand, she turned towards the table in the kitchen. On it sat another letter. After receiving the postcard, she had responded in kind. A few weeks later, a large envelope was waiting for her in the mail. Inside was her sent postcard and a letter written by Nellie's granddaughter. Nellie had died the same day, shortly after writing the letter to her friend, only a week after St. Patrick's Day. A long battle with an unnamed disease had left her weak and nostalgic. She wrote the postcard as a way of saying goodbye without the finality of relaying her troubles. Her body was found floating under a dock. The sound of it banging against the piling alerted a fisherman. She had dressed in her finest, stumbled the short walk to the ocean, climbed onto the railings, and let go. One last item was in the envelope, a small dried flower from a dogwood. This was not the first time she had read the letter. It had come almost a year ago. The paper had become worn and frayed. The words were starting to fade, and the flower had taken on the look of parchment. She put all the items back into the envelope and walked out of the room. Moments passed, and she retrieved the parcel. She had changed into a beautiful summer weight dress. It had been many years since she had had the occasion to wear such a garment, but the years had been kind to her waist as well as the fabric. Her hair was done in a simple knot at the base of her neck. Her cheeks were slightly rouged. The shoes on her feet were impractical for Noblesboro, even in the nicer months. She opened the door, and the winter air claimed all the heat once held in the small home. Her dress twisted and was tugged by the chilled wind. She stepped out onto the steps and closed the door behind her. It should have been almost unbearable to be outside in the cold. She should have felt the need to survive and retreated to the relative warmth of her home. This was not the case. With the letter held firmly in her grip, she descended the short steps and proceeded through the snow, struggling for each step in the wet blanket of frozen rain. The tears she let fall were frozen to her weathered cheeks almost as soon as they had emerged. Step by step, she pushed her way further from her home and towards the woods beyond. A local man found her body months later. She had made it almost half a mile before she collapsed and stayed down. The envelope and its contents were found tucked under a rock near her body. Protected from the elements by the stone sentinel, they did nothing to help determine what she was doing or why she had taken a walk in such conditions. The reason was her last secret, known to no one still alive.